you all for coming tonight. This is our third Midway Living History program. They've been very popular, and it's been very nice to hear what everyone has to say about living in Midway and growing up in Midway. And we're going to focus on the university tonight, so it's appropriate that we are here in our library. So thank you all for hosting us. And thank you, Grayson, for coming. Thank you, Carolyn, for taping these for us. They are all online, so if you missed the first two and like to see them, we can tell you where to go to see them. I'd like to introduce Dr. Botkin. We have just been introduced ourselves, but he was very gracious to come here tonight and to tell us his knowledge. He was president here for 13 years, so he knows a little bit about the college. And he's writing a book, or has written a book.
Finished.
It's finished. Oh, wow. So he'll have a lot to say to us. So Dr.
Congratulations.
We'll see first if we need it. Can you hear me okay?
No, it's better.
You need this?
Yes.
It's better? Okay. Well, there's no podium, so I'm glad I didn't bring the manuscript. It's a big book, but and I'm hoping that a trustee who's editing the book, who's had background in publishing, will get through with it fairly soon. And my aspirations would be to see it published this year, but it may not be. It may not be in the next year. I really don't know. But basically, I'm through with it. It's in somebody else's hands now. Well, to begin with, I just got jotted out a note or two to keep me on track, because I could probably talk an hour, and it's now close to 20 minutes till 7, so I'll try to be through sometime close to 7, and if I keep going, will somebody wink at me? So that's my understanding. The procedure is to have a time for discussions and questions and that sort of thing. Well, to understand the germination of Midway University, what is now Midway University, you have to go back to about 1842 to Madison County and in a church. And there was a young preacher holding a service that evening. He was a part of this rapidly expanding religious movement on the frontier that eventually came to be known as the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. Some others took the name Church of Christ and so forth. But it was a reform movement to try to just get back to, they thought they were getting back to simple New Testament Christianity, and the churches would all unite on that. Well, instead of them uniting, the movement eventually split asunder into 3 or 4 different sects. But this man was a young physician. His name was Dr. L.L. Pinkerton. He was a Renaissance man, to be sure. He had been baptized by Alexander Campbell, one of the main leaders of the Reformation movement. After he got a basic education, he read medicine and started practicing medicine around just north of Cincinnati, Ohio. But he had this strong sense that he should be a preacher. Back in those days, many people didn't go to seminaries and that sort of thing, especially on the frontier of the United States. And he came to Kentucky to experiment, try out being a preacher. And he preached in and around Louisville. They mostly then were starting new congregations. But eventually, he came to Midway. Now, what had happened in 1842, while he was preaching, he noticed that there was a young girl in the audience who was blind. And only later did he discover that she was an orphan. Now, to appreciate that fact, you have to realize that there was no public school system to speak of. Attempts had been made, but it had always fallen apart. Certain things didn't really even begin to think about a real school system that was public until in 1850s. If you got an education, it was because your parents were well off enough to maybe tutor you in their home or to send you to one of the academies or female seminaries, they were called. Or there were people who gathered money together and had subscription schools so that, 15 or 20 families would put in money and hire a teacher. But if you were poor, and there was lots of poverty, and if you were an orphan, and if you were a girl, you didn't have much to look forward to but a life of drudgery or worse. And so this scene in 1842 in this little church just bothered Pinkerton. He couldn't get it out of his mind. And he began to conceive of an idea of starting a school for orphan girls. Now, he was not interested in having an orphanage. He wanted it to be a school that was equal in quality of the female seminaries. But since it would be composed of girls who were destitute from families with no means, he had to see that the girls would be educated to make a living for themselves. Whereas the seminaries, where you've heard the term, they were more like finishing schools. If you move to a couple of years forward to 1844, Pinkerton had come to Midway. And he had a very close, he preached in Midway. I believe it was 1844 on Christmas Day. It was his first time he preached at the little new Christian church here. And one of the leading elders was James Ware Parrish, who's this man right here. And this is Pinkerton. Parrish was enamored with Pinkerton. He had baptized him when, for a very brief period of time, Pinkerton preached out on Old Frankfort Pike at the beautiful little church out there called New Union Christian Church. And Parrish came forward in one of those services and asked to be baptized. He was a landowner down the road here, very well-to-do, and he was made one of the leading elders of this new church. And the story goes that it was a dark and stormy night at a prayer service that was supposed to come, and nobody showed up but Pinkerton and Parrish. That may be an apocryphal story, but whether it is or not, it doesn't matter, because at some point, Pinkerton shared with Parrish his dream. And they talked the Midway Christian Church into sponsoring this new school. And they went out and started raising money. They collaborated with another very well-known Kentuckian, James T. Johnson of Scott County, who had been a former congressman, and he had a brother who had been vice president, but he too had been enamored with the idea of preaching, and he had given up politics to become a preacher. And Johnson's role was to go out into the community on these preaching missions and gather money for this new school, which would be used as an endowment for the school to help it in its operations. In the meantime, Pinkerton, and particularly Parrish, were busy in Woodford County raising money to buy property for the school and to build a building. They had enough money in 1846 to begin making plans for a charter, which they got in 1847 from the legislature of the state of Kentucky. And Parrish came here and bought this hillside, this hilltop. This was the original purpose, I think about 5 acres. I don't know exactly where the new building was, but it faced the railroad track. And Johnson, writing about this, said it was a commodious building. It was a beautiful building, and it was designed to hold about, with the help and the matron and the superintendent and so forth, and about 20 students with in a maximum capacity. They thought they could operate the school for $1,200 a year. The dollar went a long way back then. Well, so they got the building finished. Pinkerton had this idea that he would try to educate the young women to be teachers. It was, the legislature had finally, a few years earlier, said it was okay for women to teach. So most of the teachers were men. Many of the subscription schools weren't very good because the men who couldn't do anything in life, and so they decided to teach. But the really good schools were run oftentimes by ministers, the seminaries and academies, who were all well educated. Well, be that as it may, Pinkerton thought that he would have a curriculum in which the young women could be teachers. And another option for people who couldn't be or didn't want to be teachers would be seamstresses. Now, this wasn't just a second best. And really, in reality, when you reflect on it, it may have been a better choice for a woman to go this way because she could make a good living. She could start her business. She made hats. She could make mantuas, they were called, tailor-made suits and so forth. It turned out that originally they had a laboratory, you might call it, for teaching seamstresses in this new building. But that soon kind of fell by the wayside. I'll explain that in just a moment. But in October 3rd, I believe it was, 1849 was the beginning of the school with 15 students. It was a tough little student body. It's never been explained, but one of the girls who had been admitted was only 3 years old. She couldn't have been a student. She was sickly and she died the next year, in the spring of the next year. But the girls who were a little older were practically illiterate for the most part. A man who was from Missouri was the first superintendent or principal, John T. Lawson, and his wife was matron. She had an assistant, and there were other helpers to, take care of the cooking and, outhouses and so forth. Had at the end of the year, they had a recitation open to the public for the girls to show off what they had learned, and the people were absolutely amazed at the progress that they had made in just 1 year. Pinkerton's goal was to take girls who were 12 years old, and no one could stay at the school more than 4 years, so from 12 to 16. And the idea, the way we would understand it today, they would get what would be equivalent to an 8th grade education. Now, try to remember that for a long, long time, in the rural parts of Kentucky and other states, an 8th grade education was an achievement. There weren't any high schools. The only people who went to high school were people in cities that taxed people extra so they could form high schools. So if you had an 8th grade education, you could be a teacher yourself. In fact, it was well into the 19th century, about in the 1920s, I believe, when the people who taught with an 8th grade education became a minority. It was not until the early 1900s that women became the majority of the teachers. So an 8th grade education was quite an achievement. Now they had this beautiful building and they decided to expand it so they could hopefully take up to 40 or 50 students. And they went about that and they achieved that. A very impressive building. Well, what happened was that the place had sanitation problems, and an eye disease broke out that infected the girls, and it off and on it went on, but it got so bad that in 1857-58, they shut down the school for a whole year in order to sanitize the place. They didn't know what was causing it, but it was given a thorough antiseptic cleansing. And they reopened in 1858. They had lost Lawson. He had to make a living, so he went back to Missouri. But they had a new superintendent or principal, its titles weren't formalized, a man named Robert Broadhurst. He was an ingenious, very, very bright, effective teacher and administrator. On, I forget just exactly the day and month, but it was in 1858, on a Sunday morning when everybody was out down the road at a funeral, and a few people were in church, that the new building caught fire and burned to the ground. The churches had not followed through with the money that they had pledged. So there was always money problems. They had built this beautiful building, and it was burned to the ground. The records were all burned up. What to do? Just throw in the towel. They refused to do that. They got to work, and they raised new money. They built a brick building that wouldn't burn so easily, that was eventually to be called Pinkerton Hall, right over here, still in operation. We can thank the Lord that that tree that fell fell this way instead of demolishing Pinkerton Hall. It was a long time before it was called Pinkerton Hall, by the way. It was just the school building for a long, long time. But they were able then to take, with the new building, sleep the girls there, the classrooms were there, and so forth and so on. And they had 30, 40 students. It was crowded. But it was very successful. But at that point, the idea of being a seamstress just dropped out. I don't know why. You don't hear any in the records, don't say anything at all about it. And so Broadhurst said that from 1958, the school was basically a normal school. If you're not familiar with that word, that means a teacher training school. And they taught, they tried to give the girls a liberal arts education, but also be well educated enough to be a teacher. Pinkerton, I hope we'll have time or questions. We'll talk about the tragedy of Pinkerton because he became an outcast. One of the saddest things about the story of Midway University. But Pinkerton and a guy named J.W. McGarvey, who was as conservative as Pinkerton was liberal, but both well educated, worked with Broadhurst and others to come up with what would be the equivalent today of a high school education curriculum. If you would read the curriculum, you'd be astonished at what they studied, the breadth and the depth of what they studied. Since it was a very religious place, one of the things that set it apart from other seminaries was that there was always an in-depth study of the Bible. It was a regimented place because the girls had to get up at a certain time, do this, do that, do the other, be in their classroom at the proper time. And in the midst of it all, they had to attend church and say their prayers and so forth and so on. So for up to the time of the starting of the nursing program, which I think was 1973, if my memory is right, it was quite a religious place. It got a little more secular into the middle of the 20th century, but not to speak of. So they taught this curriculum that was to prepare students for teaching, and we will have to skip over a lot, but when you come to the 1880s, see, I'm almost done and I'm only up to 1880s. When you come to the 1880s, it was recognized as producing the finest teachers in the state. They took their examinations at the Capitol, which gave them a special diploma and a teaching certificate, and they were greatly sought after. Things began to change at the turn of the century for lots of reasons, and you need to remember that there were students who didn't graduate, who dropped out, students who got married, students who could work in retail, various kind of jobs that they had rather do. But the preponderance of the graduates became teachers. But when you come into the early part of the 20th century, things are changing. Many of the girls didn't want to be teachers, and there was a woman trustee. They started having women trustees at the end of the 19th century. There was a woman trustee who put forward the idea of having a home ec program, which would be another outlet for employment. And then there was an emphasis on business. They tried to start a business program, but it flopped. They even set up a junior college curriculum, and there wasn't enough interest among the girls to take the junior college course, but there were about 2 graduates in the junior college before it was closed. So there were college graduates at the orphan school going all the way back to about 1918, 17, just after the First World War, 17, 18, 19. They produced a couple of college graduates, junior college graduates. But when you get to the 20s, there was a great interest in business. And so the school began to offer business programs, which proved to be the most successful. These business programs began to take the place of teaching. Now, there were always girls who could graduate who would go on and teach. But a new phenomenon of the day began to put pressure on the teaching program, and that was the normal schools, the normal colleges like Eastern Kentucky State and Western, and eventually Morehead and so forth. The standards were being raised, and so teaching gradually faded away in a response to the new situation, and girls began to take courses in business. And so from about 1930 on up to the early 40s, it was basically a business school. A new issue in the external world had an impact on the school, and that was school buses. And pride in being a member of the high school in the county, and go to the football game and be a cheerleader. And it was free. There wasn't much need anymore for orphans to come over to Midway. And so enrollment was declining. At that point, a director of development had an idea of turning the place into a junior college. His name was Edgar Riley. He was the first person to have a name of president. And he put forward the idea, and they worked toward that goal. And about, I think it was 41, let me see, I've got it here somewhere, it doesn't matter. It was 1941 or 1942. My book's got it right. They got the junior college going, but they didn't shut down the high school. There had been a big controversy for years about being called an orphan school. The girls hated it. And Riley and others loved it because it was a good fundraising device. But they had to change the name when they got to the point of having a junior college program. But it was modeled after programs in California that started in the cities. And so what we had at Midway at that point were grades 7, 8, 9, and 10. That was Pinkerton High School. And grades 11, 12, 13, and 14 was Midway Junior College. It was, you know, an odd mix of things. And it had its ups and downs. But at any rate, it got off the ground. The story of it beginning, of getting approval from the trustees to become a junior college is a nightmare. In fact, I believe Edgar Riley was under so much pressure that he was the second CEO to die in office. He died in 1945. And I feel my own self, I can't prove this, that the stress he endured with the trustees and other people in starting the junior college program actually killed him. But at any rate, he got the program going. And the emphasis was still on business, but you have to try to get new kind of programs that girls would be attracted to go to work. And so they tried one type of program and then another, ranging everything from paralegal studies to cosmetology and on and on and on. But because of the high school problem in the counties, the Pinkerton High School got weaker and weaker. Nobody wanted to come. And so eventually they had to close Pinkerton High School, and what was left was Midway Junior College. By that time, President Piper, who had followed Riley, had retired, and the attempt was to find programs that were basically what the community colleges were doing. And because the community college system was getting off the ground. And so here was another strange anomaly. How can a private college, junior college, compete with the community colleges? The regular private junior colleges were liberal arts colleges designed to transfer to a four-year degree. And since Midway still catered to girls, needy girls, they had to work the idea of getting employment. And so they got a nursing program going in 1973. And that proved to be the savior of the school. It was exceedingly popular, and it became known for its excellence. A little noted impact was this. The whole culture of the school dramatically changed. First of all, there were a lot of commuters. So up until this point, everybody had been a residential student with the culture that goes with being a residential student. Many of these commuters were older women. There were older women who wanted to get a career in nursing. They could no longer enforce that everybody had to go to church and everybody had to be religious. So the place became much more secular than it had ever been, and more secular than anything that Pinkerton or Parrish could ever envision. And the nursing program was so successful that the school, as you will remember, many of you citizens here will remember, it was virtually a nursing school. Certainly that way until in 1985 when I came, and afterwards. Over half of the graduates would be nursing school graduates. And the nursing school graduates, associate degree, were highly prized, just like the teachers back in the 1880s were highly prized. It was one of the most respected nursing programs in the state. But to skip forward, and I'm almost getting there. Skip forward. When I came here, I came under the impression that the school was prepared and wanting to be a four-year college. In fact, I was able to talk to the trustees before I took the job and said, this school doesn't have a prayer staying on as a private junior college for women. They had tried to get it going under Dr. Hoffman, but voted it down at the last minute, reminiscent of the problems that Riley had had with the trustees. Well, my agreement was that I really didn't think I cared to be a president of a junior college for women, but if I would have the agreement with them that we would try it step by step, with their approval each step of the way, we would try it. And they agreed to that. But still there were people who on the board who said, the school's trying to be smarty pants. It was made to be a school for poor girls. Now it's trying to be a baccalaureate granting institution. Problem was, if it's kept on with the old mission, it was dead in the water. Well, to make a short story long, by 1989, we had the rudiments of a four-year program in place, and we were accredited in 1993, I believe, as a four-year college. Another development had occurred in that there were business people who came to the college and asked us to offer some business programs, business classes, in the evening for their employees. Of course, they had to pay for men, just like women. They couldn't say women only. So we established what was called a School for Career Development that was co-ed. It was a separate unit. There was no cross-registration. Otherwise, we'd get in trouble with Title IX. First boy who said he wanted a basketball team, we were in trouble. But in the School for Career Development, there was no athletics, no intercollegiate athletics. It was basically an evening program. Later on, as you know, online teaching came to the fore, and that became very impressive and important. But I retired in 1998 after 13 years. I will just say that I have the longest tenure of any president up to this point. The man in the back there is probably going to beat me one of these days.
Do it, Dr. Marston. We want you to beat it.
And desiring many, many words of praise.
Yeah, we want him to be here for a while.
Absolutely. Well, most of you know things that transpired after that. There were all kinds of building programs that went on during my administration, and it continued afterwards. There was the fiasco of the pharmacy school. Dr. Marsden came along and pulled the place out of the fireplace, and literally, I think we have to say, he saved the institution. Mm-hmm. And then there was the graduate programs began to be offered in business and other allied subjects, in education, economics, and now nursing, right? Mm-hmm. And so it was appropriate to change the name to Midway University at that point. I had mixed feelings about that. It wasn't any of my business, except I was the past president, but everybody was becoming a university. But the fact is, when everybody becomes a university, you better become a university if you can. It puts you at a competitive disadvantage. And Midway is more worthy of being called a university than, say, Transylvania. Transylvania went through a period when it was only Transylvania College. And under the influence of W.T. Young, he thought it looked more sophisticated to go back to the old title when it was a university. But they have not a single graduate program, but they call themselves Midway University. Transylvania University, out of tradition. But at any rate, Midway now is a university, and Dr. Marsden had the good sense to see that women's liberation had practically destroyed the need for women's colleges. Now, there'll always be some very prestigious women's colleges like Smith and others that we could name. just because they have the money to keep operating. But schools that are designed for less affluent, have smaller endowments, just can't make it. Only about, was it John, 2% of women would even consider coming to a Midway, to a Greenwich institution. So they made the very wise decision that I had been silently saying should have been made a long time ago, to become coeducation. And the propitious thing was, of course, that St. Catherine's closed at the time Midway College became co-ed, and you know the rest. So I'll shut up. But thank you very much.
You'll be carry this on.
If anyone has questions.
Okay. All right.
Can you share any history about when Carrie Nation went here?
Yes, it was in the early days. She was in the Midway Christian Church Sunday School, and it was sometime in the early days before the 60s, I believe. But that's all I can say. Yes.
You were going to mention about Dr. Pinkerton and how he...
Yes. Well, Dr. Pinkerton felt he was a strong Republican because he believed in the Union. He believed in Abraham Lincoln. But he was also deeply moved by the teachings of Jesus, which is kind of a liberal idea, you know. The rest of the Christian church movement, particularly here in Kentucky, was rather conservative. In the 1850s, about 57, I believe it was, Pinkerton preached, he didn't preach, he gave a very sophisticated lecture on whether it is better, whether we're more civilized today than we were back then. And he followed a French philosopher named Rousseau in developing that lecture. And so he talked about all the degradation, licentiousness in Europe. And then he moved to England and to London. And then he moved to New York. And everybody was saying amen. And then he moved to Kentucky and to Lexington. And in that lecture, he tells about a slave auction in Lexington that he had attended, where he saw a woman and her little children separated and sold. And in the most eloquent way imaginable, he condemned that with great passion. For some reason, people said, kind of a nutty guy, isn't he? But he was loved because he was a physician, he helped cure people, he taught. He was so effective that people would put up with a little bit of his idiosyncrasy. He sold his school, the Baconian Institute, in the current president's home. He bought it back again about 1858 and opened it as a co-ed school instead of an all-girls school. You have to remember, this didn't have anything to do with the school up here. That was the way he helped make his living. But that would indicate he planned to stay in Midway. But a guy named John, let me see, what is his name? I should know that backwards and forward. That doesn't, I'll have to, I thought I had it written down, I could refer to it. I can't remember names anymore like that. Oh yeah, John Bowman. John Bowman lived in Harrodsburg. He was quite well-to-do and is a member of the Christian church. And he tried to reopen a failed, the first disciple college in Georgetown called Bacon College. He tried to move it to Harrodsburg. He did that. But he reopened it as Kentucky University. And he talked Pinkerton in resigning up here and going down there and to be a teacher of literature, which Pinkerton did. Some of his students followed him and so forth. The war broke out shortly thereafter. Pinkerton finally decided that he had to use his medical knowledge in the service of the Union. And so he became in the Union Army as a surgeon. He made his way to Louisville, where he was in the process of probably struck down by heat stroke. But he worked incessantly in Louisville, mostly taking care of people who got infections and so forth, because more people died in the Civil War and things like that than bullets. But he fell down exhausted, thought he would die, and then he was brought back to Harrodsburg, and he lived. In the meantime, after the war was over, nobody wanted anything to do with Pinkerton. He was radioactive. Beloved before, now despised. John Bowman talked the state legislature into making Kentucky University the new land-grant university that Lincoln had put in land-grant colleges and universities, provided he could move to Lexington and take over the campus of Transylvania University. And so for a long time, there was no state university out in what we now call UK. It was Kentucky University. And Pinkerton was a teacher there. But he felt like he had to resign. He was a detriment to the school because he stood in the way of him making progress because he was so despised. So he resigned, but he would not leave Kentucky. He stayed and was going to be a missionary, as it were, to the black people here in Midway and all other places. He was virtually poverty-struck. And he only was able to be saved from absolute bankruptcy because his friend James Garfield, Congressman James Garfield in Ohio, who eventually became president, got him a job being a mail inspector in eastern Kentucky. On one of those trips, he came back to eastern Kentucky, came back, got sick, and died in 1873, I think it is. So he during that time, he continued to preach like a prophet, made everybody mad. He had a very caustic personality, evidently, but it was on principle that he spoke the truth, usually in love, but sometimes in anger, I imagine. So that's a tragedy of Pinkerton. The trustees turned against him. There's so many sad stories. The organization of the school reflected the racist culture of Kentucky in every respect after Pinkerton was gone, including not allowing the little black Christian church here to have a school on the school property. It's a sad, sad story. So that's the story of Pinkerton. I might mention while we're talking about notables, there are 2 or 3 other people that should be mentioned without whom the school would not have existed. There were wonderful CEOs, presidents or superintendents or something, most of whom were women. There's only been one woman president, but there were really, really effective women superintendents. 95 years of the school's existence, the schools have been run by women, which is not often known or thought about. But the chairman of the board was a minister of Christian Church, minister of Broadway Christian Church, Mark Collis was his name. He was extremely conservative. All of the leaders, Midway Christian Church was with the liberal wing of the Christian Church. Edgar Raleigh, who was his development director, was with the liberal wing. So here Collis is kind of caught in the middle. There was a lot of animosity in the first half of the 20th century between the liberals and conservatives, evolution and all of that, and church organization. But Collis had been minister of Midway Christian Church, and in 1885 he was made a trustee. And in 1893 he was named chairman. And even though there was a split about religious issues, he handled it with great aplomb. He was greatly admired and respected. He spent a lot of time on the college campus. And he continued to be chairman until when? 1945. Without his good sense and guidance, the school would have exploded during Raleigh's time when he tried to start the junior college. He died, he finally resigned when he was 93 years old. He forced them to accept his resignation. He remained a trustee, although he stopped coming. And he died finally in Good Samaritan Hospital when he was 103. So he's, without him, I don't know what would have happened to the school. This man right here needs to be mentioned, John Starks. John Starks was born in Midway, went to Midway Christian Church, moved away, became very successful in real estate, lived in Louisville. There's a Starks building in Louisville. Ms. Montjoy, the very effective superintendent, tried to get Starks on the board, and he turned her down. But finally, about 1923, when he was in his 70s, he accepted. And accepting to be a trustee, he never did anything half-hearted. He was a bull in a china closet, but he thought the school was in the dark ages. They didn't even have an audit. Wasn't, they just kind of did it in-house. I've read every minute of the board and the board of the executive committee of the board since, I guess, 1860, maybe it is. And I want to tell you, the great struggle is to decipher those men's penmanship. The secretary of the school, which was always a woman, about the 20s, started being the secretary of the board, or the recorder, not the secretary. And the woman always wrote so you could read it. But Starks had to give a special report to the board. And when I turned to it, I was delighted. It was the first time that anything had ever been entered into the record that was written on a typewriter. But Starks brought the school into the modern age with modern business practices. He also was very generous with his money. The school badly needed a new classroom building and a new dormitory. And he was so effective in raising money and giving money that I think it was about 1931 or something like that. I can't carry all those dates in my head. That Edgar Raleigh was now here as business director and as development officer. that the thing was, his leadership was so successful that they built the Starks building and started Alumni Hall, which is now called Buster Hall, all at the same time. And so he was very, very effective and very, very influential in pushing the school in the right direction from an administrative point of view. Now the third, and probably the most important person I should mention, is Belle Wisdom. Belle Wisdom Hall, right to my right, your left. Belle Wisdom had been attracted to the orphan school and had left a charitable remainder trust or an annuity to help in business work. But she was very, very wealthy. It's an intriguing story about her and how she came by her wealth, but we'll forego that. But she lived in Houston by that time. She was from Kentucky. Her father was quite successful, one of the most wealthy men in Kentucky in her childhood. But she lived in Houston. And her father had left, again, it's a long story, how she got, as this one remaining daughter, all of this property, some in California, real estate, and mineral rights, about 5,000 acres of mineral rights in and around Houston, and some up in the Panhandle in Texas. Riley knew, it would appear, that she was going to change her will and leave everything to the orphan school. He died. So Piper was made president, and Mrs. Riley wanted a meeting. It was a big test. So he went out to Houston, and it was in June of 1945. He came back and told Mrs. Piper, and I had the privilege of knowing Mrs. Piper, of course, told Mrs. Piper that he thought he had passed the test. He did. She changed her will. She left 2 or 3 people $10 so that they'd know she knew what she was doing. She seemed to be in good health at age 83, when I am now. By September, she was dead. And all of a sudden, the school had a sulfur mine, all sorts of oil revenue from oil wells, real estate in California, and to keep from having a big lawsuit, the school gave the family the real estate business in California, and the children, grandchildren and so forth, got 1/10 of the mineral rights. 9/10 belonged to the college. Well, you can't believe the money that came in. And I'm here to tell you that in some years, the school still was suffering for money. And then some years, Ms. Wisdom's estate provided about 50% of the operating budget, year after year after year. It was still a cash cow when I came here in 1985. There is no doubt that if Ms. Wisdom had not left the school the oil money, the school could not have continued to operate. But interestingly enough, she not only provided this money, she influenced a man and wife named Mr. and Mrs. Fred McManus, when they liquidated their foundation, to give money to make McManus Student Center. So she's quite a gal. And most people, nowadays you say, Belle Wisdom, who's she? What difference does that make?
Well, we know.
One of the great delightful things about doing this book is that I hoped that people will come to appreciate in a profound way those who have gone before, without which the school could not have survived. Okay, any more questions?
I've got a question, actually. I do some research on the history of the school here, and one of the things that I can't find a lot of information about in the archives here is the equine programs and the beginning of the equine program.
Mhm.
And that would have been a little bit before your time, I think, that it started.
Just barely, yeah.
But can you tell us anything about how the
Yes.
equine program started here?
Yes, I can tell you. The equine program was started as an experiment with a guy who was mayor of Midway and out here, and somebody else, Arch McManus, I think he was a banker, and they provided horses for the girls to ride horses just for
Recreationally.
pleasure. And that was the germ of the idea. Well, where we are in central Kentucky, the horse capital of the world, why don't we start a program that would maybe appeal to wealthy girls and their families to come to Midway College and major in equine studies. And that got going. And along with it was equine riding program, intercollegiate competition. And when I got here, it was top of the line. It was the best equine competition riders in the country. And they combined business with equine studies, and many young women got jobs in the equine industry, even with just an associate degree. And so when I was president, we really upgraded. We had 2 PhDs. We greatly improved the program, and it became a bachelor's degree program.
Oh, wow.
And it was very successful, highly enrolled.
Still business-based, the equine business.
It was equine business. It was great.
Interesting.
And you could still get the associate degree, but you get a bachelor's degree. And that was in place before I left. We lost one of the PhDs to Texas A&M, and I retired, and I don't know what happened next. But
it was the
wasn't
beginnings of it
good.
that I was interested in, so thank
It
you.
wasn't good. But I understand it's on a rebound. Is that
Oh,
right,
it's
Don?
outstanding now.
Yes.
Watching the slideshow behind you,
Yeah.
and I was wondering if you might be able to identify some of the people in the slideshow. Not the students, but
Well, that's Parrish. That's Mars Hall. It's more students, of course.
That's,
That, I don't know.
that is Miss Mountjoy, or Joy, Mountjoy?
Mountjoy?
Yes, mhm,
That would be when she was much younger. I
Yes.
have some pictures of her when she was older.
yes.
Not, I can't say. This is Graves Amphitheater. This is Mark. That was Mark Collis.
Yes, and the lady there was Fannie Mae Graves. That's the day of the dedication of the amphitheater.
Of the
Yeah.
amphitheater. She gave the money. She's from Scott. She was from Scott County, Georgetown.
Yeah.
She wanted a library to be named after her. That was before this building, the old library and the administration building. But
When was Graves dedicated? I have to-
36, I think.
who are those people?
Oh, and another contribution of Stark's. Stark's wanted everything to be done first class. So when Louisville was developing and wanted to make a beautiful city out of it, the city leaders hired the Olmsted brothers to do their landscaping and their parks and so forth. They had a gigantic plan for their parks and the way they'd be situated at strategic parts of the city. When Starks got on board, he saw that this was a beautiful campus with great potential. he hired the Olmsteds to do the landscape design for the campus. The bridge, the bridge over the creek was designed and approved by the Olmsteds. Their influence, their fingerprints are everywhere.
Who's that man?
That is Patterson,
Yes.
power plant. He was a Midway Christian Church elder, and he was a workhorse. So it was appropriate that about 1912, under Ms. Montjoy, they finally decided to name the building. And Parish Hall had been built by that time. So they named the big residence hall, Victorian building, Parish Hall. Patterson had to be built first to provide the steam to heat the building. And the original building was named Pinkerton Hall. By that time, people had calmed down in Kentucky, even in Midway Christian Church, which had ostracized him and recognized him as a great man. So his portrait is in Midway Christian Church stained glass window today. And that building was built about 1893, somewhere in that area. And they came up to the school, and the school gave them a mortgage to build the building. So I'm wondering, what was I talking about? Yes, ma'am.
Does the college still retain some mineral rights from?
Oh,
the
yes,
area?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I think they've been offered up for sale at various times, and the school doesn't get nearly as much money now as they used to. But in my time, we would sometimes get about $1 million a year, $100,000.
I bet you wouldn't mind getting that.
Wish we were getting that.
That'd be, maybe we'll strike it rich.
Well, I know that there are a lot of gas deposits in the Panhandle that were discovered, but there was no delivery mechanism. And I would imagine that that's very valuable still. And with fracking, redoing wells, they could revive it again. But probably not to the extent that it was at one time. Yes.
The orphan girls, were their parents fell to a pandemic of some kind?
Help me, I'm not, don't hear very well, I'm deaf in the right ear.
The girls that were orphaned,
Uh-huh.
their parents were killed by a pandemic, I understand. Do you know what that was?
Well, there was this great flu epidemic at the end of the Second World War. But I don't know, the conditions for admission were you had to come from a broken home.
Right.
A father may have died or skedaddled, but you could have one parent, and if you had this one parent, you were eligible to come. They made some people pay because they had extended family and churches that could support them. And they had an elaborate formula by which they would charge someone who had come who had some support. The ones who had no support were called beneficiaries, and they were supported by the endowment. There were always a few people, it would seem, when I say always, most of the time it would seem, that some of the local people came who weren't orphans and paid the full ride. But the school needed that just to meet the budget. So the pandemic was not, I can't identify with that. But the big flu after the First World War, the college here, or the school at that time, it was quarantined for a number of months. Nobody could come in or out. Eventually one girl, it happened on 2 different occasions. Eventually one girl caught, I don't know what it was, but she passed away. And she was the only casualty of that terrible period.
Call? like
Spanish flu.
Cholera.
Spanish flu in
if-
1819, or 1818,
I really don't remember whether it was cholera that came, it may have been the second round may have been cholera. The first round was the flu. And Miss Lucy Peterson, who was the assistant principal and then principal after Miss Montjoy, has a little book, I hope you have it someplace.
It's
called
over there.
Miss Lucy's Story.
Yes.
And she tells about the flu epidemic and so forth. I got my information mostly from her, but also there's some information in the minutes. Well, you've been very patient. Yeah.
When the book is available, can we all buy one if we want, or is it going to be just for the college?
Yeah, for $100. No, of course.
Okay, wonderful.
The Ms. Metzger, you know, has agreed to put up a certain amount of money to get the book published, and for she herself will see that it will be published in the right format and so forth. The mock-ups of it's a beautiful book. It's about 400 pages. It's double columns and pictures interladen throughout to go along with the text. I think the school will be very proud of it when and if it comes out. Some people will say it's too long, it's long-winded, too many details, but what we're trying to do is to preserve the history step by step by step. If somebody wants to come along later and do a Reader's Digest version, that's okay. But my work has preserved the details of the history step by step by step.
Because there is no other history after there was one written in 1940 and then a master's thesis that was written in the 1960s. And after 1960, if you're trying to find the history of the school, you better talk to President Marsden or President Bodkin, because I mean that's what.
The Giovanoli book,
Right, that's the 40 one.
Really came out in '29.
Oh, did it? Well, it goes. Some of the details in there go to the 40s. So
Go back and look. He was dead by then. You may have access to something else, but the red book.
maybe what we've got has some.
Yeah, the
some
red
more
book
little
per
things
se.
in it.
There aren't
Yeah.
many copies left. I have an old, worn-out, broken-down copy, but it was very closely supervised by the trustees, who wanted a lot
That's
plastered
interesting.
over.
That's interesting.
There's not, it's better than nothing, but it's not a real good objective account.
That makes a lot of things make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
That first
Okay.
book has been gone a long time. It disappeared when I was
There's
in 46, 47.
who else? Anybody else here? A student? When?
I graduated in 94. 94?
94. I was here.
You were there.
I gave you the phone.
1994.
Yes.
I was here when it was a Kentucky Field Orphan School. In 1942, I graduated.
You graduated? Oh, my goodness.
And you were talking about coming in if you had money or you didn't have money or whatever. My dad paid $200 and Miss Lucy Peterson found the rest for me.
Oh,
Isn't that wonderful? Yeah.
that's an excellent story.
There's so many good stories like that. You know, the school, this controversy over the name, that starts in a woman trustee led, it was dynamite. They could not agree on a name, but the Starks thought orphan school was exceedingly inappropriate. Raleigh and others buried it. They actually passed to change the name. They just ignored it. They raised money by calling it Kentucky Female Orphan School. When it became Midway College, Junior College, and Pinkerton High School, the stationery says Kentucky Female Orphan School, or maybe it said Pinkerton High School and Midway Junior College, operated by Kentucky Female Orphan School. Do you know when it stopped being officially a corporation? called Midway Orphan School, 1979. Dr. Who was the president before me?
Hoffman.
Dr. Hoffman said we can't keep calling it junior college. All the junior colleges just come to college. And he talked them into changing the name from Midway Junior College to Midway College. And at the same time, he says, while we're at it, let's write the Secretary of State and say, we don't want to be the orphan school anymore as a corporation. We want to just be Midway College. So it was 1979, after being founded in 1847, that it stopped being the Midway Orphan School.
Is that when the sign disappeared?
I don't know about that.
That's what Amy Perry was wondering about. She said.
No, the sign was still up when I was here.
The sign is upstairs in the archives. Or a sign that says Kentucky Female Orphan School.
Right.
Yes. Several, actually several.
You've been very patient. Thank you.
Does your book have a title yet?
It's a story of Midway University.
That's what it's called, the story.
Colon. No, the story, but the university kind of mucked things up. Let's see. How the story of Midway University, how the Kentucky Female Orphan School became Midway University. I thought it was important to put the name in Midway Orphan School as a teaser for one thing. Now, when I came here, my wife thought it was a very peculiar name, the Midway Orphan School. She said there couldn't be anything worse except being a graduate of the school for the criminally insane.
Do any of the audience members have any stories or memories or thoughts about Midway that they'd like to tell? Yes, ma'am, please do.
I was in the library the other day, and they were telling me about this meeting tonight, and they asked me if I had any connection to the university, and I said, as a matter of fact, I do. My mother's oldest brother was the maintenance man here. I don't have a date, but they lived in the little house right over here. Mm-hmm. And I am proud to announce I have his granddaughter here tonight. The odds of her coming for a visit. And when I heard about this, I called her and I said, we're going to the university Thursday night. But I also had other things that I was acquainted with.
His name was what? I know
Thomas Hackney.
And hold up his picture.
She brought Russell Hackney.
Okay, he's not the one I'm thinking of.
No, I don't have a date. I'm thinking it was in the early 1900s. My mother talked about coming over to visit, and she married in 23, so I know she didn't come to visit without my daddy. But anyway, I remember growing up when the outside arena was built. We used to come up to the Johnsons, and my sister and we'd come over and play on that. I remember when it was built. I remember when there was a road between here. I remember when I was in high school coming up to Can and rotten carrots and all of that. I was a part of that. And my sister had special friends up here. I had friends too. I remember when the girls couldn't go to town unless they had a leader with them. And I've just got a lot of memories. Lucille Johnson, who was comptroller or whatever you want to call her,
yes.
Her daughter and I went all the way through school together. And their house was the only place that my mother would really let us go and spend the night. And because my sister was kind of sickly, and Mother knew Lucille before she ever came to Midway, and she knew that Lucille would know. My mother also knew Bill Riley. They went to school together. So, yes, I have connections with the university.
That's awesome.
And Jeannie has brought this picture of Uncle Russell, her grandfather. And so I want to proudly give it to you, and we will give dates to you.
To Caroline.
We appreciate that very much.
Caroline, we'll get
Yes, thank you very
I
much.
don't know whether she wants to say anything or not.
It's a really special evening and treasure to be here, to see Midway, and to be here for this lecture and hear Dr. Bodkin and to meet Caroline, all these beautiful people. It's a real gem, high point of my vacation.
This is Jeannie Glass.
Glad you could make it. Did you have a story that you'd like to tell?
You know, when I was in high school, I went to high school in Lexington, and they gave us a lot of research papers, and so the Midway College would let me come to the library here because I lived in Midway. And once I got home from Lexington, I didn't want to go back to Lexington, and so the library let me come here and do my research papers. And I was always really grateful that they would allow me to do that as just a citizen of Midway.
That's awesome. Was the library here in Little Memorial? It was Mars then?
Yeah.
Awesome, very cool. Yeah, we have a couple of pictures of the Mars Library going around in that
And also,
rotation.
I took my piano lessons here.
Do you remember who taught you?
I'm thinking Mrs. Hepburn?
Hepburn.
Hepburn. I'll look that up. That's awesome.
Many years with the PE teacher.
She's a good teacher.
I just want to thank you, Dr. Bodkin, for building up the equine program, because had you not, my wife probably never would have found Midway, because she came here for a good equine program. There's a little 2-year-old boy named Jackson that would be here today, too. Thank you very much for that.
Does anybody else like to share any stories about Midway? Dr. Marston?
Was this the, I have one question, real quick. Was this the first school for orphans of its type around here or in Kentucky?
In Kentucky.
Yes, as far as anybody knows, it was the first school in the world, of any type of school that was, there have been many orphanages, but no school, quality school for orphan girls. The school lost Principal Broadhurst. He resigned to go to Missouri to start a school exactly like this one, and he did. And it eventually became William Woods University in Columbia, I think it's Columbia, Missouri, where the university is.
This was the prototype for other people to model and mimic.
Yeah. I don't know of other places other than William Woods, but there may be many that I just don't know of.
Very cool.
Good.
Most of the churches involved in the orphans and the widows. I mean, the churches were the ones that did the early days,
Before
Yeah.
there was a school like that.
before there was
Yeah.
any kind of school like this.
May I stand up to say one other thing? Okay. That's a good point. Very few of the churches ever supported Midway College very much, big money.
We didn't dance.
Why, the influence of the church came through members of the Christian church who left property, put the school in their wills. Under Edgar Riley, when he was the development director, he started a massive annuity program where people made, made an investment in the school, got a lifetime income. And then when they passed away, that came to the school's endowment. So the school's endowment grew gradually from that. And they were almost always church people. There are a few exceptions where that was not true. But then the trustees had, being conservative as they were, they shied away from stocks and bonds. And they started making loans for people, for businesses and mortgages for homes. And that became a huge industry. Some of you know that. And Mr. Endicott was the manager of all of that. And he actually had an office in Lexington where he spent 2 or 3 days there doing the mortgage business of the school. The school hardly ever had any defaults. And so when the Depression came, the school was in mortgages and not in stocks and bonds. So the school weathered the Depression very nicely. And when I came, there was one or two mortgages still out. They matured, and the trustees decided to give up to $75,000 loan to faculty members and employees for a mortgage, and we did that. Eventually, that was phased out. But another part of the endowment, besides those mortgages, was from the oil depletion allowance of Miss Wisdom's estate. That provided the bulk of money that then the banks in Houston began to invest as an endowment. So the endowment comes from those mortgages, by and large, and from Mrs. Wisdom's estate. So she not only provided cash flow, she provided money herself for the endowment.
Did you have something that?
Well, I thought of another memory. When I was a little girl, they would have May Day here every May, and it was my favorite event here. And I remember there was a picture. I remember the girls, well, I was a little girl, but I thought they were like princesses. They were so beautiful, and they all wore these airy white dresses, and they had wide satin sashes around their waist, and there were satin ribbons going up to the pole, and they would weave in and out, and I thought it was magic when I was a little girl.
They used to let us out of school to come up for May Day.
How cool is that? That's
My mother
neat.
said that she made her May Day dress in home.
You made your May Day dress in home.
Home for May Day.
Wow, that is really cool.
I got a million of them. My daughter wants me to tell you, which one you want me to tell them first, about when, of course, it was Kentucky Female Orphan School, so we never saw boys. So when I went home on vacation, I rode the bus, said, I'll come back. Let me smell your clothes, let me smell this outside world. And if somebody would have company and there'd be a young man involved, we were all hanging out of the windows yelling, "Man on campus." It was exciting.
And that they brought the boys from the Millersburg Military
Oh, yeah,
Academy.
when we had a prom. They brought the boys from Millersburg Academy. We didn't dance, but they were here, so that was part of our prom. And I made my dress for that, too.
Later on, they allowed dancing.
Pardon?
Later on, they allowed dancing.
I know.
And Georgetown College boys in the Millersburg Academy.
Yeah, but then, you know,
They would come over. We have many
back in
pictures
42, it was all
of the
different.
dancing. So it loosened up a little bit, but not too much.
But in 1942, when you guys had prom, because I have pictures of prom in the 1940s, there were gentlemen there, but you weren't allowed to dance.
Oh, no,
Am I understanding that?
We just talked to them, you know.
That's awesome. Dr. Marson, please.
Just wanted to add that, as Dr. Botkin pointed
At
out,
the time.
the institution has struggled at various times in history. We've had low points and high points. And certainly during his tenure, he was able to move the institution to a 4-year degree, baccalaureate degree granting institution, and established a school for career development, which really brought significant revenue to the institution at that time. And more recently, we've had to go through some significant changes as well to make sure we remain relevant and viable. Dr. Botkin's been working on this book for several years, and he's been very patient so that our last chapter would end on a high note. And we're at a high note right now at the institution, so we thank Dr. Botkin for
Very much. We're at a great high note.
Well, I honestly can say this is the only place like this in the world.
That's awesome.
Thank you all for being here.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you very much.